The night Genghis Khan died, the earth itself trembled. I was there, crouched in the shadows of his gyre, watching as the great conqueror's breath rattled like autumn leaves against stone. The storm outside howled, as if the Tengri themselves were mourning, and the wind carried with it the scent of burning yak dung and something darker, something that tasted of endings and blood. His sons gathered around the felt walls like wolves circling wounded prey, but none dared enter while the Khan still drew breath. Jochi was already dead, they said, though some whispered he had been poisoned by his own father's hand. Chagatai stood rigid as winter iron, his scarred face catching the firelight that danced through the tent's smoke hole. Urgedai clutched a leather drinking pouch, his knuckles white as bone, while Tolui, youngest and most beloved, pressed his forehead against the cold earth and wept tears that froze before they touched the ground. The shaman Teb Tengri had been called, but even he stood silent, his deer antler headdress casting twisted shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The old man's eyes were wide with something beyond fear, a recognition of forces that even his spirits could not contain. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like breaking ice. The eternal blue sky claims its own. I remember the exact moment the Khan's spirit departed. The fire in the brazier guttered and died, plunging us into darkness so complete it felt solid, tangible. The wind stopped. The horses outside fell silent. Even the distant howling of wolves ceased, as if every living thing on the steppes held its breath in that sacred, terrible instant. Then came the sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth, growing louder until it filled our skulls and vibrated in our chests. When dawn broke grey and cold across the Mongolian steppes, the great Khan was gone, but something else had taken his place. Not death. Death would have been merciful. What remained was a hunger, a void that demanded to be filled. His body lay still and ancient, but his presence lingered like smoke that refuses to disperse, clinging to everything it touched. If you think the story ends with his death, you couldn't be more wrong. The empire Genghis Khan had carved from blood and bone stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. It was too vast for any single man to hold, too hungry to remain united without the iron will that had forged it. His sons knew this, they had always known this, but knowledge and acceptance are different beasts entirely. Chagatai was the first to move. Even before the funeral fires had cooled to ash, he was riding west with 10,000 riders, claiming the lands of Khwarezm and Transoxiana as his birthright. His face had always been marked by bitterness. The scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, earned in a childhood fall from his horse, had twisted as he grew, giving him a perpetual sneer. But it was more than flesh that had been wounded. Chagatai had lived his entire life, knowing he would never be the chosen one, never be the heir his father favored. Now, with the Khan dead, he meant to take by force what had been denied by blood. His riders moved like a plague across the Western territories, but they carried with them something darker than conquest. Villages that surrendered reported strange dreams afterward, visions of the great Khan rising from his grave to demand tribute from the living. Livestock sickened and died for no reason. Wells that had run sweet for generations turned brackish and foul. The very air seemed to carry whispers in a language that predated human speech. Chagatai himself changed during those campaigns. His trusted general, Munka Khotan, confided to me years later that his lord had begun speaking to empty air, holding long conversations with shadows. He would wake screaming in the night, clutching at his throat as if invisible hands were strangling him. And always, always, he spoke of his father's eyes, watching him, judging him, finding him wanting. Meanwhile, in the eastern lands, Tolui gathered the bulk of the Mongol army to his banner. As the youngest son, tradition granted him the Ochigin, the hearth and homeland. But Tolui wanted more than tradition. He wanted to resurrect his father's spirit, to become not just Khan, but the vessel through which the great conqueror could continue to rule from beyond the veil of death. The shamans who served Tolui were different from the traditional Tengrists who had guided Mongol spirituality for generations. These were shadow speakers, practitioners of arts that predated the arrival of humans on the steppes. They came from the deep taiga, from places where the sun never fully set or rose, carrying with them bone flutes that could call the spirits of the unquiet dead, and mirrors made from black ice that showed not reflections but possibilities. Under their guidance, Tolui began the ritual known as the Kagan's Return. It required 7 nights of bloodletting, 7 days of fasting, and the sacrifice of 7 white mares, 1 for each of the directions recognized by Mongol cosmology, plus 1 for the journey between worlds. The ceremony took place in a hidden valley where ancient petroglyphs depicted scenes of shamans communing with wolf-headed spirits and winged serpents that devoured the moon. I was present for the final night, hidden among the rocks that surrounded the ritual site. What I witnessed there still haunts my dreams, still makes my blood run cold when the wind blows from the north. Tolui had grown gaunt from his fasting, his eyes sunken so deep they seemed like holes in his skull. The shamans had painted his body with symbols drawn in a mixture of mare's milk, his own blood, and something they called the tears of the eternal sky, a substance that gleamed silver in the firelight and seemed to move of its own accord. As the moon reached its zenith, Tolui began to convulse. His body contorted in ways that human flesh should not bend, and from his throat came sounds that no living man should make. The shamans chanted in their ancient tongue, their bone flutes shrieking like the voices of the damned, and then impossibly I heard another voice, deep, commanding, unmistakably familiar. It was Genghis Khan, speaking through his son's lips, but the words were wrong. Where the great conqueror had always spoken of unity, of bringing all peoples under one vast sky, this voice spoke only of vengeance, of turning the world into a graveyard where only the dead could rule. The horses at the ritual's perimeter reared and screamed, their eyes rolling white with terror. Even the shamans fell prostrate, trembling before the force they had summoned. But the possession was imperfect, incomplete. Tolui's flesh could not contain his father's spirit any more than a broken dam could hold back a flooding river. The ritual collapsed in chaos, the possessed prince collapsing as the entity that wore his voice retreated back into whatever realm it had emerged from. When dawn came, Tolui was changed, marked by his brief contact with that dark intelligence. His hair had gone white as bone, and his eyes held a terrible knowledge that aged him decades in a single night. Urgadai, meanwhile, pursued a different path to power. As the chosen heir, he might have been content to rule through wisdom and diplomacy, but the ghost of his father would not let him rest. Every decision he made was haunted by the question of what the great Khan would have done. Every policy, every military campaign, every moment of peace was measured against the impossible standard of a dead man's legacy. The wine helped at first. It dulled the whispers that seemed to follow him everywhere, the sensation of invisible eyes watching his every move. But as the months passed, and the empire began to fracture under the weight of civil war, Urgadai's drinking deepened from comfort to necessity to something approaching madness. His court in Karakoram became a place of strange rituals and stranger guests. Mystics arrived from Tibet, bearing scrolls written in languages that hurt to look upon. Chinese alchemists brought powders that promised to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Persian astronomers charted the movements of stars that existed only in nightmares. Urgadai commissioned the construction of a great mausoleum for his father, but it was unlike any tomb ever built. The design came to him, he claimed, in dreams where the Khan himself provided the specifications. It was to be built not up toward the sky, but down into the earth, a spiral descending into darkness where the laws of nature grew thin and malleable. The workers who labored on the tomb reported disturbing phenomena. Tools would be found arranged in patterns that spelled out words in scripts no one recognized. Sections of wall would collapse overnight, only to rebuild themselves in different configurations by morning. And always there was the sound, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the very stones, growing louder as they dug deeper. But it was the discovery of the chamber at the tomb's heart that broke the minds of those who saw it. The workers reported finding a room that could not exist, according to any known principles of architecture, a space that seemed larger inside than the entire structure that contained it, filled with a darkness so profound that torches would not burn within it. And in that darkness, they claimed, sat a figure on a throne of bone and black ice, waiting with the patience of the eternally dead. News of this discovery reached the other brothers through whispered reports carried by traders and spies. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Whatever tentative peace had existed between the warring siblings shattered like ice struck by lightning. Each brother now understood that Ogedei was not simply building a monument to their father. He was creating a gateway, a means for the Khan's restless spirit to return and claim what it considered rightfully its own. The war that followed was unlike anything the world had seen before or since. It was not merely a struggle for territory or succession, but a battle for the very soul of the Mongol Empire. Brother fought brother across battlefields where the laws of nature seemed temporarily suspended. Riders reported seeing the ghosts of slain enemies fighting alongside the living. Arrows would change course mid-flight to seek out targets that their archers had never aimed at. The very ground beneath their horses' hooves sometimes trembled and cracked as if something vast was trying to claw its way up from below. Chaghatay's forces, already touched by the strange malady that had settled over his western territories, brought with them a plague of nightmares. Soldiers in his army stopped sleeping, claiming that rest brought visions too terrible to endure. They fought with the desperate fury of men who knew that death might be preferable to the dreams that awaited them in slumber. Their banners, once bright with the colors of conquest, had faded to the gray of old bone, and the wind that followed in their wake carried the scent of graves. Tolui's shamanic warriors were perhaps the most disturbing of all. The failed ritual that had changed their lord had also marked them, and they rode into battle accompanied by spirits visible only as distortions in the air, patches of cold that moved with purpose and intent. Enemy soldiers would be found frozen solid despite the warm spring weather, their faces locked in expressions of absolute terror. The shadow speakers had taught Tolui's men to fight, not just with sword and bow, but with fear itself as a weapon. And then there was Yochi, who was supposed to be dead. The reports came from the northern frontiers first, from traders who swore they had seen the eldest son of the Khan riding across the steppes with an army of men who cast no shadows. Yoshi had been the most warlike of the brothers, the most like their father in his ruthless pursuit of conquest. His death had been a relief to some, a tragedy to others. But now it seemed that death had not been willing to claim him permanently. The thing that wore Yochi's face was both more and less than the man who had died. It possessed all of his military genius, his tactical brilliance, his understanding of the art of war. But it also carried with it an absolute coldness, a lack of any human warmth or mercy that chilled even his own supporters. His army grew as he rode, but not through recruitment or conquest. The dead themselves rose to join his ranks. Battle against Joki's forces became an exercise in horror. Enemies slain in the morning would rise again by evening, their wounds still bleeding, but their eyes holding no spark of life. They felt no pain, knew no fear, and could only be stopped by complete destruction of their physical forms. Even then, some claimed that their spirits lingered on the battlefield, waiting for new flesh to inhabit. The war reached its climax at the Battle of the Black Winds, fought on a plain where ancient shamans had once conducted rituals so dark that the very earth had been poisoned by them. All three armies, Chaghatay's Nightmare Legion, Tolui's spirit-touched warriors, and the undead host that followed the thing that had been Yochi, converged on this cursed ground as if drawn by some malevolent magnetism. The battle lasted 3 days and nights, though witnesses disagreed on whether it had been 3 days or 3 years or 3 lifetimes. Time itself seemed to flow differently on that corrupted plain. The sun would rise and set multiple times in what should have been a single hour, or hang motionless in the sky for what felt like ages. Warriors would age decades in moments, or find themselves fighting alongside companions they remembered dying hours before. At the center of the chaos, the three brothers met in single combat that was both deeply personal and cosmically significant. They were no longer simply fighting for an empire. They were fighting to determine which aspect of their father's legacy would survive, which interpretation of his will would become reality. Chaghatay fought with the fury of the perpetually overlooked, his scarred face twisted with decades of accumulated resentment. Each blow of his sword carried with it the weight of every slight, every moment when he had been passed over in favor of a more favored sibling. But his anger, vast as it was, paled before the forces that his brothers had embraced. Tolui wielded powers that no mortal man should command, calling upon spirits that existed before the world was formed. The air around him shimmered with barely visible presences, and his weapons seemed to strike at multiple targets simultaneously, hitting not just flesh but spirit, not just the present moment but echoes of past and future. Yet for all his supernatural might, he remained fundamentally human, and humanity was both his strength and his fatal weakness. The thing that had been Yochi was perhaps the most terrifying of all, for it fought with the knowledge of the dead and the inexorable patience of entropy itself. Its movements were economical, precise, devoid of any wasted effort or unnecessary emotion. It did not seek to defeat its brothers so much as to outlast them, to remain standing when all else had crumbled to dust. As they fought, the very fabric of reality began to tear around them. The sky took on colors that had no names, and the ground beneath their feet became transparent, revealing layers of existence that mortals were never meant to perceive. Through these dimensional fractures, other eyes watched the battle, ancient intelligences that had been waiting eons for such a moment of weakness in the world's defenses. The end came not through victory, but through mutual destruction. The powers that the brothers had embraced, the forces they had allied themselves with, proved too great for any mortal vessel to contain. One by one, they began to burn from within, their bodies unable to channel the cosmic energies they had sought to command. Chaghatay was the first to fall, his accumulated rage finally consuming him in literal flames that burned cold and blue. He screamed as he died, but the sound that emerged was not his voice, but the collective anguish of every person who had ever felt overlooked, every soul who had died, knowing they had never been truly seen. His ashes scattered on a wind that carried with it the whispers of the forgotten. Tolui lasted longer, his shamanic training providing some protection against the forces that destroyed him. But the spirits he had summoned were not content to serve. They were hungry for the taste of mortality, and they devoured him from within like invisible parasites. As he collapsed, his body aging rapidly until it crumbled to dust, he spoke a final prophecy. The Khan will return when the world forgets how to remember. The thing that had been Yoki simply faded, its borrowed flesh returning to the grave from which it had emerged. But its final words were perhaps the most chilling of all. We are all already dead. We just haven't realized it yet. With the death of the three brothers, the great Mongol Empire began its inevitable collapse. But this was not the gradual decline that historians would later chronicle. This was something far more sudden and absolute. Across the vast territories that had once bowed to the Khan's will, people simply began to forget. Not ordinary forgetting, the kind that comes with time and distance, but something deeper and more profound. Entire cities would wake one morning to find themselves unable to remember why they had ever feared the Mongols. Languages that had been spoken for generations became unintelligible overnight. Skills passed down through families for centuries were lost as if they had never existed. The Mongol warriors themselves were not immune to this selective amnesia. They would find themselves in foreign lands with no memory of how they had arrived there, no understanding of why they carried weapons or wore the armor of conquest. Some adapted, blending into local populations and living out their lives as farmers or merchants. Others went mad, driven insane by the knowledge that something vast and important had been stolen from their minds. The capital city of Karakoram became a ghost town within a matter of months, its great halls and temples standing empty as its inhabitants drifted away like smoke dispersing in wind. Those few who remained spoke of hearing voices in the night, of seeing figures moving through the abandoned streets, not the ghosts of the dead, but the shadows of forgotten memories, searching for minds that could remember them into existence. The great mausoleum that Ugadai had constructed for his father became a place of particular dread. The structure itself seemed to resist being forgotten, standing like a monument to things that should not be remembered. Travelers who passed too close reported experiencing vivid flashbacks to lives they had never lived, memories of conquests they had never participated in, dreams of a vast empire that spanned continents. Some scholars who studied the phenomenon in later years theorized that the Khan's spirit, unable to find a suitable vessel among his sons, had instead infected the very concept of memory itself. By making himself too important to forget, he had paradoxically ensured that forgetting him would become a form of psychic self-defense. The human mind, they suggested, had chosen collective amnesia over the alternative of remembering something too powerful for mortal consciousness to contain. But there were others who believed that the forgetting was not a defense, but a preparation, that the Khan's spirit had not been destroyed but merely transformed, spreading itself across the collective unconscious of humanity like a virus waiting for the right conditions to reassert itself. They pointed to the strange dreams that continued to plague people across former Mongol territories, dreams of endless steppes and thundering hooves and a figure on horseback whose face could never quite be remembered upon waking. I have lived longer than any man has a right to live, and I have seen empires rise and fall like waves breaking on a distant shore. But nothing I have witnessed has prepared me for the weight of carrying these memories alone. For I am the last one who remembers, the only surviving witness to the true fate of Genghis Khan's sons and the empire they destroyed in their struggle to possess it. I have tried to forget, as the others did. I have drunk myself into unconsciousness, seeking the peace of oblivion. I have traveled to the farthest corners of the earth, hoping that distance might dim the clarity of these cursed recollections. I've even sought out shamans and priests and learned men, begging them to provide some ritual or technique that might free me from the burden of remembering. But the memories cling to me like shadows at noon, sharp and inescapable. I see their faces when I close my eyes, not as they were in life, but as they became in their final moments, transformed by the forces they had tried to command. I hear their voices on the wind, calling to me across the centuries, demanding that their story be told. And so I speak these words into the darkness, hoping that someone somewhere will hear and understand. Not for the sake of history, which has already chosen to forget, but for the sake of warning. For the powers that consumed the Khan's sons were not destroyed when they died. They were simply set free, unbound by flesh and waiting for new vessels to corrupt. There are signs for those who know how to read them. Leaders who speak of destiny and conquest with voices that echo across centuries. Nations that seek to unite the world under a single banner, driven by ambitions that seem to come from somewhere beyond ordinary human desire, the stirring of something vast and patient in the depths of the collective unconscious, something that has been waiting for the right moment to resurface. The mausoleum still stands, though few remember what it was built to contain. The chamber at its heart remains sealed, but sometimes, on nights when the wind blows from the north, travelers report seeing lights moving in its depths, cold, blue flames that cast no shadows but illuminate truths that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. And in the deepest vaults beneath that accursed structure, carved into stone that predates human civilization, there are words written in a script that seems to shift and change when observed directly. Those few scholars who have managed to decipher fragments of this text speak of prophecies and warnings, of cycles that repeat across millennia, of an empire that will rise again when humanity has forgotten the cost of remembering. The Khan's empire never truly fell. It simply learned to hide, to wait, to spread itself across the consciousness of the species that had once knelt before its banner. And sometimes, in the spaces between sleeping and waking, in the moments when the veil between worlds grows thin, I can feel it stirring still, patient as stone, inevitable as winter. His sons fought to inherit his legacy, never understanding that they had already been chosen, not as heirs, but as vessels, not as rulers, but as sacrifices. Their destruction was not the end of the story, but merely the beginning of a longer, darker chapter in the history of human ambition and the prices it demands. The empire lives on, not in the annals of historians or the memories of the conquered, but in the dreams of those who hunger for power beyond measure. It whispers to them in their sleep, promising dominion over all things, offering them the chance to become more than merely human. And always, it demands the same price that it claimed from the Khan's own sons, everything that makes them who they are, consumed in service to something vast and hungry and eternally unsatisfied. I'm old now, older than mountains, older than rivers, kept alive by the weight of memories that refuse to rest. My bones ache with the cold of too many winters, and my eyes strain to see through the gathering darkness that marks the end of all mortal stories. Soon I will join the others in whatever realm awaits those who have carried such burdens for so long. But before I go, before I surrender these memories to the wind and silence, I leave this warning for those who come after. Beware the promises of destiny. Question the voices that speak of inevitable conquest. Remember that some legacies are too poisonous to inherit, and that some empires are built not to last, but to consume. The Khan's sons learned too late that their father's greatest victory was not the empire he built, but the trap he laid for those who would try to claim it. They sought to become him and lost themselves in the process, becoming vessels for something that had never been entirely human to begin with. And now, as the last light fades from my eyes and the final breath rattles in my chest, I feel them gathering, the spirits of the conquered and the conquerors, the remembered and the forgotten, all drawn by the weight of a story that has finally found its ending. They whisper my name in languages that predate speech, calling me to join them in whatever vast silence awaits beyond the veil of mortal existence. But even as I prepare to cross that threshold, I know that the story itself will never truly end. Somewhere in the depths of human consciousness, in the dreams of the ambitious and the nightmares of the wise, the Khan's legacy continues to stir. His empire waits, patient and eternal, for the moment when humanity forgets enough to remember what it chose to leave behind. The wind carries his name across the steppes where it all began, and in that wind, those who listen carefully might still hear the thunder of hooves and the whisper of promises too terrible to keep. The sons are gone, but the Father endures. Not as he was, but as he became, transformed by death into something far more dangerous than any mortal conqueror could ever be. Remember them, because history never did, and in remembering, perhaps we might learn to forget what should never have been remembered in the first place.